The glow of tiki torches cut through the darkness as hundreds of white supremacists paraded through the campus of the University of Virginia in a show of force and racism that shocked the nation. The next day, those same white nationalists, Klan members, skinheads, and other extremists gathered to protest the removal of a monument of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. They were met by hundreds of counter-demonstrators, most of them peaceful protesters. But there were others spoiling for a fight, and as many had feared, violence erupted. Before the day was over, dozens of people were injured and 3 people were dead. Virginia State Police Lieutenant H.J. Cullen and Trooper Burke Bates died when their helicopter crashed. 32-year-old Heather Heyer was killed when a car plowed into a crowd of protesters. The car's driver, who earlier had rallied with a white nationalist group, was charged with second-degree murder. And Charlottesville made headlines around the world. The right to free speech and to express one's views is a constitutional freedom on which this country was founded. The right to protest the beliefs of others is an equally important freedom, and it's up to you as law enforcement officers to protect your community and its citizens as they exercise these rights. You may be tasked with upholding the free speech rights of hate group members, even hardcore racists, in the face of opposition from your own citizens. But the stunning images out of Charlottesville showed there are lessons to be learned on how law enforcement can work to prevent speech from spiraling into violence. Despite being the largest hate rally in this country in at least a decade, the March on Charlottesville was hardly an isolated incident. In June 2016, Sacramento officers found themselves dealing with a riot on California's Capitol steps when fewer than 24 racist skinheads and their supporters fought with more than 400 counter-protesters. The removal of Confederate monuments has also mobilized many white supremacists into public protests. Richard Spencer is a prominent white nationalist and a leader in the so-called alt-right movement, which seeks the preservation of what it calls white identity. In May 2017, he and other members of this movement were in New Orleans to protest the planned removal of 3 Confederate monuments. Standing with them were former Klan member David Duke and members of the League of the South, which is a neo-Confederate hate group. The League's Chief of Staff, Michael Tubbs, was hard to miss, towering over his troops as the estimated 150 racists squared off against a crowd of 500 supporting the monument's removal. Tubbs' criminal record is even harder to ignore. In the early 1990s, he served 4 years in prison for stealing weapons and explosives from military bases while he was a Green Beret. Tubbs and his brother had created their own racist group, and the stolen weapons were allegedly intended to be used against targets that included African American and Jewish-owned businesses. Given Tubbs and the League's involvement in New Orleans, it should have come as no surprise to Charlottesville authorities that he and his group, Klan members, and more were expected at the August rally. And only 3 months earlier, the Loyal White Knights of the KKK came to Charlottesville to protest the removal of the Lee Monument. About 50 Klan members and supporters were met by an estimated 1,000 counter-protesters. 22 people were arrested, and tear gas was used to disperse the crowd. In May, Spencer and several dozen protesters held a torchlight march in Lee Park in Charlottesville. It was a scene that would be repeated in August, but with more than 10 times the crowd. But despite dealing with 2 prior events and multiple warnings, Charlottesville officials saw their city in the headlines and their law enforcement response questioned. So what happened? Law enforcement was criticized for not intervening during physical confrontations between rallygoers and protesters. Both groups said officers watched as assaults occurred and did not respond. A post-event analysis offers a few lessons. Big changes to the situation require big changes from the commanders. Event organizers wanted to hold the rally at the Lee Monument. City officials said that they could not ensure public safety in such a small park and moved the location to a larger park nearby. The day before the rally, a federal judge ruled that the event could remain at the original, smaller location. How could commanders deal with this? Well, look, there's no easy way. But one way this could have worked would have been to draw a large perimeter around the smaller park by blocking city streets. This would have still provided ample space between rally-goers and counter-protesters and allowed the commanders to retain the core benefits of their original plan. Rally-goers could have been bussed into the rally site, then escorted to the main area, as suggested by DHS intelligence and Virginia State Police. And keeping the opposing sides apart is critical. In real estate, the three rules for value are location, location, location. Responding to civil actions involving opposing groups and where intelligence indicates the possibility of violence, remember, separation, separation, separation. A week later in Boston, an estimated 40,000 people turned out to protest a rally that some feared might be attended by white supremacists. With tension running high, things could have turned out like Charlottesville. But after the event, Police Commissioner Bill Evans reported that no citizens or officers were seriously injured. As he said, quote, "Overall, it was a good day for our city in that we won't tolerate hatred and bigotry." Boston officials heeded the lessons from Charlottesville. They placed more than 500 police officers into the Commons area. They installed security cameras. Backpacks and bags were searched. And again, separation was crucial. Officers used barricades to set up a buffer zone. They also moved to separate the two groups during confrontations, and they ended up escorting the rally-goers off-site in police vans to keep them away from the counter-protesters. It's important to note that Charlottesville and Boston were two very different events. The rally in Boston occurred in a major city, which is more accustomed to dealing with large events and civil disturbances. There was a smaller number of rally-goers, and no firearms were allowed under state law. The open carry law adds a new dimension to the challenges faced by law enforcement. Boston police also had the benefit of learning from Charlottesville, where intelligence indicated that plans for violence had been brewing for weeks. Violent confrontations by anarchists or anti-fascist activists, also known as Antifa, were on full display there. This movement is decentralized and often unorganized, making it that much harder for officers to handle. Adding to the problem is many Antifa purposely wear all black clothing, making it difficult for law enforcement to identify specific individuals. Antifa is real. They have wreaked havoc at these rallies. Ask any officer in Portland, Seattle, or San Francisco. But let's not forget the facts. The threat of domestic terrorism from the radical right is long-standing. Charleston, 9 parishioners murdered at Mother Emanuel Church. Overland Park, Kansas, 3 killed at a Jewish community center and assisted living facility. Oak Creek, Wisconsin, 6 shot and killed at a Sikh temple. And in Pittsburgh, 3 police officers murdered by a man who frequently posted on the white supremacist website Stormfront. According to the FBI and DHS, white supremacists were responsible for 49 homicides and 26 attacks from 2000 to 2016, more than any other domestic extremist movement. So how can lessons from Charlottesville be used to help craft your agency's response when hate groups and counter-protesters come to your town? Here are a few suggestions. Do your background research. Research the hate group that's holding the event, its history, beliefs, leaders, and key followers. Find out if any counter-protest groups have shown up at the hate group's events in the past. Map out a solid strategy for the event. Consult with city officials, including legal counsel, when deciding whether to approve the event location. Free speech is protected, violence and intimidation are not. Assign an officer to stay in contact with the hate group's official representatives before, during, and after the event. Designate a specific time and location for the group to gather. Participants can be screened for weapons at this location if legally permissible. Establish a command post for the incident commanders away from the center of the event. Make plans for dealing with counter-protesters. If an opposing group does plan a formal counter-demonstration, inform them of the strict guidelines for the event. If possible, have an officer assigned to stay in contact with their designated representative. Have an entry checkpoint for counter-protesters where they are screened for weapons. At a 2011 neo-Nazi rally in New Jersey, counter-protesters had to return to their vehicles to dispose of rocks, tire irons, and wrenches. You can reduce face-to-face confrontations by restricting counter-protesters to a specific area, if legally allowed. If the event is a march, try to set the route so it does not go directly past the counter-protesters. Work with your community. Members of your community, especially racial and ethnic minorities, may feel threatened or afraid of a hate group coming to their town. Meet with community leaders to ensure that they are not caught unaware or feel uninformed. Make sure they understand the event will take place under strict security guidelines. Encourage them to speak out publicly against bigotry, but ask that they urge citizens to stay away from the main event. Recommend that they organize an alternative event at the same time and on the same day in a location well away from the hate group's activities. Assign an official law enforcement liaison and any other officers as needed. Enforce pre-planned buffer zones, routes, and gathering places on the day of the event. Erect some type of barrier to cordon off the event to separate participants from counter-protesters. Establish a joint information area for the media and staff it with your public information officers and those of partner agencies. During the event, commanders need to be able to quickly deploy their officers where violence breaks out. Small teams of 6 or 8 officers can sometimes be very effective in removing violent actors, but the on-scene commander must have the ability to respond immediately to on-the-ground activity. Establish a cyber desk at the command post that can receive video feeds and photographs and be able to disseminate as needed to law enforcement and/or the media in real time. Conduct a thorough post-event follow-up. Keep 1 or 2 intelligence officers and the cyber team at the command post after the event. Review the event footage for any unforeseen developments or deviations from your original plan. Prepare an after-action report for your department and other law enforcement agencies. Regardless of the size of your department and your community, in order to effectively respond when hate comes to town, it's essential that you as a law enforcement professional remain objective and focus on keeping all the citizens safe. Though it may be a difficult balancing act, remember that you are the thin blue line that protects the constitutional rights of free speech and assembly of every person, regardless of their beliefs.